Welcome back to Practical Stoicism. I'm your host, Tanner Campbell. As usual, that hasn't changed, but something that has changed is that you are getting a new episode on a Wednesday. What is that about? Well, if you haven't heard me kind of gearing up for this in previous episodes, maybe you fast-forwarded through those parts. Today's episode is the first of a new weekly edition of the podcast that will, when possible, include interviews with philosophical thinkers, Stoic thinkers, things that I believe will add value to not just your Stoic practice, but your overall love and appreciation for philosophy in general. Today's guest, the first of these interviews, is Kieran Setiya. Kieran is a philosophy professor at MIT, and he's the author of two books that I know of, the first being Midlife, and the second being one that just released yesterday as of recording, called Life is Hard. Of course, we know life is hard, we all know that, but what this book is a attempt on Setiya's part to give you actionable advice on how to deal with these difficulties in your life. These interviews are never meant to be self-promotional for the guest, so usually what I'll do is what I'm doing now. I'll give you the upfront plug. They have a book. In Kieran's case, it is Life is Hard. It's out on Amazon or anywhere else you purchase ebooks, audiobooks, or print books because it comes in all three varieties. And if you enjoy the conversation with Kieran, I want you to go and support him by purchasing the book, because if you think we cover a lot in these 45 or 50 minutes of interview, the book covers a lot more. A quick reminder before we get started, if you do not like ads in your podcast, you can become a premium subscriber to this podcast by going to stoicism.supercast.com. I hope you will, because part of the reason I can now introduce this second episode every week and additional things that are coming soon is that some of you elect to give me a few dollars every month for that premium version of the podcast, so it pays dividends. And again, if you're interested, stoicism.supercast.com. And with that, here is my conversation with philosopher Kieran Setiya of MIT, author of the book Life is Hard. Kieran, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate you taking the time. I know you are a busy man.
It's lovely to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
You have just released a new book. I think when listeners hear this episode, it will be one day since it's become available on Amazon and elsewhere. Can you talk a little bit about it? The title is Life is Hard. What inspired you to write it? What is it about? Let's start there.
Well, yeah, I had this amazing revelation that life is hard. Probably people were aware of that already. So it's a philosophical approach to the good life. But the idea is, what would it look like if we approach that question, how to live, without ever losing touch with the fact that life is hard? So not aiming for unrealistic ideals, always living in the world as it is, not the world as we wish it would be, recognizing that we can't always be happy, but we can strive to live well, and that living well involves not just worrying about yourself, but about how you should treat other people. And the book, that's the sort of approach the book takes, but it ranges over a bunch of topics, beginning with the frailties of the body, infirmity, through loneliness and grief, failure, injustice, the absurdity of the universe, or hopefully the meaning of life. And then it ends with a chapter on hope.
Well, I don't want you to ruin it by telling us what the hope is, but I would like, and I love that we start, it was my intention to start with that question, but the way you answered it has set me up really to jump into the conversation that I know you and I really want to have for the sake of my listenership, which is, what is the benefit of philosophy to the average everyday person? I think that within the last 50 years, let's say, philosophy has become this thing about leather-bound books on big bookshelves and PhDs, and it's become this thing that people mostly ascribe with elitism, and I think that's very much to the detriment of your every man or every woman. And so many people have gotten so far away from being philosophically minded. I think that this is a great conversation, or a great opportunity to have a conversation that reminds them why philosophy is not just central to the enjoyment of life, but central to creating a life which is ever increasingly better, not just for yourself, but for everyone else, and almost a responsibility in that way.
I agree with all of that. So, tracing the history of philosophy, I think it was only really in the 18th century that there became a kind of split between philosophy and what philosophers might now roll their eyes at by calling self-help. I do not roll my eyes at it myself. That I think before then, it was just taken for granted that philosophical reflection on the question how to live should make your life better. And I don't think people have ever stopped asking philosophical questions. People are asking every day, how should I live? Either on the small scale, how am I going to deal with this crisis at work or with my kids, being upset with a friend at school? And they're doing philosophy. They're asking philosophical questions, but there's come to be a real divide between the way academics talk about these questions in philosophy departments like mine and the way in which people raise them in ordinary life. And I don't think that's inevitable. I think we can bridge that gap. I think there's more of a continuity between philosophical theory, philosophical argument, and just the everyday reflection on how to live, in which you try to describe your circumstance and say, what's actually happening here and what am I going to do about it, than philosophers sometimes acknowledge. And so, yeah, I think there's a kind of happy moment right now of a meeting of supply and demand in which people really feel an urgency to reflect on their lives. And philosophers like me are more than ever in my academic lifetime wanting to speak to a wider audience.
Do you find yourself speaking to an increasingly younger audience? That's been a surprise and, quite frankly, a joy of mine with my podcast.
Well, it's funny. I mean, as a college teacher, there's a way in which some significant chunk of my audience is perpetually young. In fact, although like every other middle-aged academic, they also seem younger every year. I'm sort of, I'm aging and they seem kind of completely permanently youthful. But I do think I think the current generation of young people are in a very different situation than I was in. I'm not sure how it was for you. I grew up under, I wasn't particularly, my family wasn't particularly wealthy, but I was comfortable and I had a kind of confident expectation that my life prospects were rosier than my parents and that things would get better from where I was. And right now we have a generation of young people who are looking at the world ahead of them and they rightly don't feel confident of that. They feel afraid of what the future holds, both in terms of their own life prospects, their career and so on, but also in things like climate change, or the kind of faltering of democracy. So I think there are special reasons why young people now might be gripped by these questions. And, I think older people should be thinking hard about them too.
Well, staying on that for a moment, if you don't mind, you just talked about how there was this division between what philosophy used to be and what it's become. People are still asking themselves these philosophical questions. They can't help but do it, but it seems like they've lost the tool set by which to answer those questions, to explore answers to those questions. And you've just said kids today have more difficulty than their parents did, as opposed to you and I. Our parents, we always felt better off than they were. I'm 39. How old are you?
I am 46.
Okay, so we're not too far apart. We're from my father is 82. So I have a little bit of an older father than most people my age. But I remember thinking from my father's generation to mine, hey, man, this is great. I've got Nintendo. There's always food in the fridge. There's snacks all the time. Life felt like I was glad I wasn't drafted for Vietnam, which my dad was. Those kinds of course, war still exists, but not like it did then. Life on the whole seems to be better. So these young people are facing all these problems. They're asking philosophical questions of themselves. They don't have the tool set to answer them. What can we do about that?
Well, I think we're both trying to do something. So I think one thing is podcasts like yours, which bring philosophy to a wide audience. There's very, few barriers to entry. You can just sort of pick it up and listen. And that seems to be a thing. I mean, I do think the philosophy podcasts, there aren't just a few of them. It's that there's an audience for it. And then there are people like me who are sort of trained as academics, but are writing and speaking to a kind of general audience who don't necessarily have any particular academic background in philosophy, but are just interested. And I think there's a real mix of taking people back to classical sources of wisdom and trying to take what's happening in philosophy now, sort of cutting edge ideas in philosophy, and just make them more available to people. All of that, I think, is valuable. And also, ideally, it wouldn't just be one way. There would be, and maybe you've found ways to do this in sort of more interactively, to have avenues for people to communicate back, to make it a dialogue so people are really reflecting philosophically for themselves and proposing their own answers to questions. And, I think social media and the internet, for all of their problems, do offer venues for doing that, new ways for doing that.
Encyclopedia Britannica back in probably earlier than the 50s, but the copy I have is from the 50s. They published a great suite of books called The Great Literature of the Western World, or The Great Books of the Western World. And I've just recently purchased it about 3 or so months ago, and I've started reading through it. And in some of these books, I'm finding, especially in the first one that kind of introduces you to the series and how to read it and what you expect to gain from it and why people created it in the first place, it's amazing the issues that were being dealt with in the 50s and in the 40s and that are still being dealt with today, as if we don't already have some sort of idea of how to solve them. And the reason I bring that up is because you just mentioned introducing younger people to traditional sources. So we'll say Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, the names everyone knows. There does seem to be an increasing tension with the way that the world is changing as far as its view of institutionalized education and just institutions in general. There's almost a conflict and there's a tension. How can we overcome this tension that young people feel about listening to, and I guess I'll call it what many people call it, old white men with old white men's sensibilities and experiences? How can we convince them that those old white men, while they, may have their blind spots and certainly do, how do we let them know that they're worth reading, that they're worth knowing what they came up with and what they thought of thousands of years ago?
That is a really interesting and hard question. I don't think I have a simple answer to it. One thing that I find helpful is to engage with them critically. So I think it's helpful when I'm, say, teaching students that I am raising questions about whatever we're reading together. So it's not being presented as a collection of answers that you just have to memorize, but as a living tradition that you can engage with yourself. And so there's room for critical perspectives. There's room to disagree. I think that's part of what makes philosophy an exciting discipline to be part of. And so I think that helps to some extent. I mean, I think it's also true that in academic philosophy, the canon has expanded in ways that I think are very fruitful. So it's hard and slow, but there's a kind of effort to teach more non-Western philosophy. Hard because people who are trying to do that weren't themselves trained in it. So they're now trying to learn later on in their career and hire new professors to teach this stuff at a time when higher education is under financial stress. But so I think expanding the canon to include traditions other than the tradition of Western philosophy, to include voices other than white men, is also part of where this has to go. And, one thing people will often say when they're reading Stoic philosophy is, if they've read some Buddhism, is, it's interesting. It's got this in common. It's this kind of contrast. There's something, the friction between them is really fruitful and illuminating. So I think widening things out in that way is only going to be good for all of these different philosophical traditions and for people's engagement with these ideas.
Something I've said a number of times on the show, this may be the dozenth time I've said it, is Stoicism is not the absolute correct philosophy. There is no such thing as an absolute correct philosophy. There are philosophies that work for you and help you to live a better life and help you to feel like you're improving the world around you. That might be an ecclesiastic religious belief. It might be Buddhism, Taoism. It might be some other ism. But it's about finding the thing that you're able to practice and the thing which objectively is not doing harm. Obviously, there are, I think, bad philosophies out there that one could ascribe to. Nihilism is one of them. I don't think that's a particularly useful philosophy. Recently wrote something on that I'm not sure if you read or not.
I did. I just looked at it right before we started talking. I was reading it, so it's fresh in my mind. Yeah.
Well, so my question to you, I guess, on the back of that is, do you think there's any such thing as a bad philosophy?
I do, and I think it's really important to hang on to the idea of philosophy as a truth-seeking enterprise in a way that means you have to be open to the idea that sometimes the search for truth falters. And so I think there are ideas that are really unhelpful. I mean, so I would agree with you that nihilism is one of them. And it may be that, if you meet someone who's a committed nihilist who says, look, I just don't think anything matters, you're not going to be able to argue them out of it, because anytime you try to make an argument appealing to something that might convince them that something matters, they'll just say, well, I don't agree with any of your premises and I don't think that matters either. So I think we do learn something from this, which is that being a truth-seeking enterprise isn't the same as being an enterprise in which you can expect everyone to just agree to the same views. And sometimes arguments give out. But so I think we should be very kind of humble about what we know and open to other perspectives. But yeah, I think if there weren't the possibility of going astray or getting things right, it would be unclear how philosophy was different from just other perfectly helpful things like, listening to music to relax and for therapeutic purposes, which sometimes is a great thing to do, don't get me wrong, but it's different from trying to think through in a serious way the truth of your life, which I think is essential to philosophy.
Oh, the truth of your life. I like that. Do you think that there's such a thing as personal truth? I hear a lot, and this is especially true I have nothing against self-help. To some extent, I think that's what all philosophers do. I think it's certainly what I am doing with my podcast as a form of self-serve, self-help. But there is definitely a brand of self-help that seems a little gimmicky and huckstery, where they say things like, find your truth. And that has given rise to this idea that there is no objective right or wrong. Morals are a strictly human concern. Everything is relative. This is a very difficult argument, I think, even conversation to have. And it's especially prevalent among the youth, I think maybe because they're so disenchanted for the reasons that we talked about before. And that's been a real struggle with some of the conversations that I've had with listeners of this podcast in private or in my monthly kind of mastermind, I guess we could call it. But really, it's just a group therapy session more than anything else.
That sounds great.
So what do you think of that? What do you make of that?
I agree with you that these issues are difficult and that there's a real danger here. There's a kind of way of approaching philosophy where you just think, just pick one, whatever suits you. Right. Existentialism this week and Stoicism next week, in which you're not really taking it seriously. It's like picking clothes off a clothes hanger. And you're just not really doing philosophy if you do it that way. On the other hand, I think there's a kind of browbeating dogmatic mode in which one could insist that there are right and wrong answers, which would involve saying, guys, listen to me, I've got it all figured out, which really no one has got it all figured out. So I think what we want is a middle ground on which philosophers use the word epistemology for theory of knowledge and epistemic meaning to do with knowledge, that we should have a kind of epistemic humility where we say, there are right answers, and I'm pretty sure certain views are wrong. And then there's an array of views where I think, if I had to place bets, I would place bets on this view. But the only wise way to proceed would be to have some doubt about one's own position and to be very open to learning from other positions. But I think, when it comes to this, the really radical relativism, I said you can't argue someone out of being a nihilist. But if someone... there's this sort of temptation to say, how could there be objective answers? Who really knows? But most of us, when push comes to shove, if someone says, well, yeah, that's why I torture people for fun, because after all, why not? Would say, well, hold on. There are some limits. That's definitely wrong. Or, that's why I spend all my day, this is an example from the philosopher John Rawls, I spend all day counting grass. Or, Sisyphus, the life of just rolling a boulder up a hill and down again, that's what it's all about. You would say, I think you're missing something in life. I think there really is an impoverished life. I don't think you can prove that those lives are missing something, but I do think we should be pretty confident that they are, and then be open-minded about a whole range of other positions.
I used to host a podcast whereon I had this conversation about relative morality versus objective morality, or I guess maybe more appropriately objective versus subjective morality. And I cannot for the life of me remember who came up with this concept, but it was a YouTube video that I found particularly striking. Maybe you'll know it, but I don't know if this fellow is a member of academia formally. I think he was just a guy on YouTube who had a clever idea. He said, look, there is no such thing as an objective morality, but we could create our own kind of subjective objective, which is that we could say that there are three things that matter in determining the moral outcome of an action: the intent of the action, the effects of the action, and whether or not anyone's personal freedoms were disturbed. So, did you hit someone? Well, what was your intent in hitting someone? Self-defense. What was the outcome? You hit someone and you hurt them. Were anybody's rights violated? Well, no. Okay, well, then this is morally good. And if you came up with something that was morally neutral or morally bad, I thought that was an interesting concept, but there is no such thing as an objective morality, right? Don't we have to, and I think this is part of what philosophy is, and I want you to disagree with me here because I'd love to hear your opinion.
Okay.
Philosophy seems like the tool with which we create a moral system of fantasy for ourselves and ascribe to and live by. Almost like someone picks up a personal credo or joins the military and thinks that that's the important thing, or becomes an artist and thinks that's the important thing. I've always thought that while philosophy does exist as kind of a fictitious objectivity, or whatever you derive from your philosophy, it's something that's important to do, because if you don't do it, then you really are then adrift in this kind of subjective relativism that you can't escape.
Well, laying my cards on the table, I suppose I do think that there are objective moral standards. So I do think that if someone said, my thing is torturing people for fun, they would be doing something wrong. And that's just a fact. And I keep stressing that we couldn't necessarily argue them out of it, because I think one reason why people sometimes say, I'm not sure how there could be objective morality, is because they think, well, I don't know how I'd convince that person to stop doing what they're doing. And the right response there, I think, is to say, well, you might not be able to convince them. That doesn't mean that they're not making a grave mistake. And I think there's a kind of idea that's a little bit different from the kind of subjectivism, but is close to it, a kind of pluralism on which there's just many different good ways to live a life. Some are objectively out, like torturing, being a Nazi, whatever. But there's many, many good ways to live a life. And they're objectively good, but there's no objective ranking necessarily. And that what we have to do there is sort of figure out which of the decent ways we could live our life is the one that's actually going to make sense for us. But that's sort of compatible with thinking there really are objective standards. I mean, one thing to say about the worry about objective standards is, as the sort of flood of information, or misinformation, I should say, online has made clear to us, even when it comes to plain matters of fact, even is the earth flat is one of them, you can find yourself in a situation where you're arguing with someone and you have no idea how to persuade them out of it, because they're so far down the rabbit hole that anytime you try to produce an argument, they'll have some theory about where your argument was misleading. I don't think that should make you think, hey, maybe I don't know the earth is flat. It should make you think, yeah, argument has its limits. And I don't think we should be necessarily more worried about the limits of argument when it comes to ethics than we are in science. I think the difference is less about the limits of argument or the existence of objective truth, and more that in science, there aren't several different right answers often. There's really just one right answer. The earth is not flat. Whereas in the case of ethics, there are often, as it were, many right answers. There's lots of different things you might devote your life to and ways you might structure your life, all of which are good, but you do need to figure out one of them. And if you're sort of adrift.
Let's move into a discussion about the two primary benefits of philosophy. We're going to talk about happiness, and we're going to talk about service to your community and to others. So outward benefit and inward benefit. Stoicism places a pretty large premium on inward benefit. We want to make sure we have resilient minds, that we're strong for down times, but it also, in its writings and teachings, suggests that part of our responsibility is to be useful to our community, to be useful to our governments, to be playing a role in the outside world to the outside world's benefit. And that one of the ways that we do that is by first becoming those strong-minded, stoically minded individuals. I want to talk about the concept of happiness, which is what a lot of people, I think, especially younger people, and maybe it is true of me. I don't consider myself to be a young person anymore, at least not as young as some of my listeners. That gets worse every year, right? It's true of me that I'm seeking happiness, but I feel as though happiness is this kind of malformed concept, as if it is a destination rather than a temporary form of elation when you get something that you want. I think that what we're really looking for is contentment. How can philosophy help us find either happiness or contentment in your view?
I think I agree with what you said, and I think I would maybe even go a bit further. I would say, when people look at Aristotle, who says, what life is about is happiness, the word that gets translated happiness is this Greek word eudaimonia, which the Stoics also use. And happiness is a bit of a glitchy translation. Really, eudaimonia is a flourishing life, or a life well lived, or a good life. And there's certainly a distinction to make here, I think, between happiness in the sense of the subjective state of feeling happy and the idea of living well. And so philosophers often point to these thought experiments like, riffing on the Matrix. Imagine someone is plugged in to a solo virtual reality thing. They're the only person plugged in. Everything that they don't know they're plugged into a virtual reality machine. Everything they're experiencing is fake. They're not really doing any of the things they think they're doing. No one they're interacting with is real. It's all fake. They may feel happy, but they're not actually in contact with reality, and they're not living a good life. So it's not like you wouldn't want someone you love to plug in. It's not like you're thinking, is that possible? I'd love my kids to just plug in and never see anyone ever again. That would be terrible. And what that suggests is there's a real contrast between just feeling happy and actually living well. Now, that doesn't mean we should not care about happiness or strive to be unhappy. But I do think we should think of it as a side effect, really, of trying to live well, trying to live the way we should. And that's why I think if you focus on the idea of living well, and this is something the Stoics are all over, is that what really matters is practical wisdom, virtue, guiding your life well. Let the feelings, we can maybe talk about what happens to the feelings, but the feelings are sort of secondary to that primary goal, which is just to try to live a good life and be a good person. And when you think of the goal in those terms, I think you do get, it sort of breaks down the barriers between yourself and other people a bit. If you think about just the feeling of happiness, whether I feel happy, whether you feel happy, seem like two independent things. When you think about living well, the question of whether I'm living well and whether I'm interacting with you in the right way, those are entangled together. And so we do get this picture that, again, the Stoics have, that living well is partly a matter of, virtue is an old-fashioned term, but being a decent person in the way you treat other people in society.
You've actually given me a really great opportunity to say, I think to my listeners for the first time, that the nightmare of translating Greek to Latin to English, never trust any of those. There's usually always something lost in that nightmare of a process.
Yeah, no, this is certainly true. And it's, I'm not the kind of scholar who really knows ancient Greek, so I'm often in the position of liking editions that will tell you what the Greek word is and so remind you whether it's the same word or have footnotes or whatever, or looking at more than one edition. And, it's a pain, but I do think, there are risks in things being lost in translation. Although I will say that nowadays, most of the translations you find are pretty good. It's very easy to get good, cheap translations of Aristotle or Epictetus or whoever made, like the Hackett editions are pretty affordable, and they're extremely well done.
One of the things that you talk about in your book, Midlife, which I've not mentioned, and that you've mentioned in other places you've spoken, interviews you've given, is telic and atelic activities. And I think that this relates pretty strongly to the idea of happiness, like we were just talking about. Can you explain what those two words mean and how the experiences of either a telic or an atelic activity plays into happiness and contentment?
Yeah, sure. So this did come out of my book about midlife, which came out, unsurprisingly, out of my own early midlife crisis. I was younger than you are now when this started happening. But the distinction goes back to Aristotle, but the terminology I use comes from linguistics, where they use it to talk about verbs. But a telic activity is one that has an endpoint or a goal, something you're aiming at. So it might just be walking home or walking to the office, or it might be getting a promotion at work, or getting married or having a kid, where you're aiming at something in the future. And the problem with telic activities and investment in telic activities is the thing you're after is always in the future. So there's a kind of frustration there. And then the moment you get it, well, that's done. It's in the past. And even worse, what you're doing when you devote yourself to a telic activity, like a project like this, is you're taking this thing that's giving meaning to your life and you're trying to extinguish it. You're trying to finish it and sort of get it out of your life. And there's something really perverse about that. So I think what happened to me around midlife was I had come to be really project driven. I was basically invested in publishing the next essay, teach the next class, get tenure, get a promotion. The structure of my life had become very telically oriented. And I had this sense that I was running on a treadmill. It was hollow in some way. Okay, so the good news is that not all activities are like that. So atelic activities are ones that don't have a definite end goal. So as well as walking to work, there's just going for a walk, as well as, recording this podcast and getting it out. There's just talking to someone about Stoicism and philosophy. There's no particular endpoint in which you're done. You could just keep doing it. And almost always, when you're engaged in projects, you're also engaged in these atelic activities that you can associate with the process. And they don't have the problem that satisfaction is always in the future or the past. If I wanted to be talking to someone about philosophy and Stoicism, there's nothing more I could do to achieve that than what's happening right now. It's in the moment. And I'm not, by engaging in it, sort of exhausting it and kicking it out of my life. So for me, a huge transition that I've tried to make was to, every time I'm getting too invested in projects, say, what's the process? The atelic activity here, does it have value? Usually the answer is yes. And am I missing it? If I could reorient myself to appreciate that value, I would be getting off the treadmill to some extent. And I think that makes your happiness less a matter of, well, I've got this, what next? And something more like, I guess this goes back to the idea of contentment you were describing earlier, something more stable and less a matter of repetition.
So this sounds a lot like the classic tension of being on that money treadmill, which I think is what most people will attribute this to. I've got to get money, I got to get success, have to be in my career. and living in the moment. Living in the moment is all the things that are happening while you're chasing that thing. That's the atelic, right? I have a good understanding here?
That's exactly right. So, and I think this is the right way to think about slogans like live in the moment, because there's a way of hearing that on which it just seems kind of nuts. Like live each day like it's your last. So what? Spend all my money? Like this doesn't make any sense. But there's a different way of thinking about it, which is try to make what you're doing in the moment a real source of value and meaning. Focus on the value of the atelic activities you're engaged in. And that, I think, really is a fruitful way to live in the moment and get off the treadmill. And as you said, you mentioned success. I think it also helps to detach you to some extent from questions of failure or success. If you, not that they don't matter, but insofar as what you're invested in is the process, how it ultimately turns out isn't the only thing that matters. There's something of value in just what you're doing right now.
How do we get our minds out of this state of constantly being focused on those telic goals so that we can, in this very self-help manner, live in the moment? Do this thing that, like you said, maybe somebody will roll their eyes and think, okay, yeah, live in the moment. Everybody says that, guru. But how do we break the behavior to get out of that focus? Because I think that is what leads to, as you outline in your book, Midlife, it's what leads to those crises. And maybe if we were better at pulling ourselves out of those focuses earlier, and I do think to some extent young people have a talent for this because they seem default as if they want to live more in the moment. But I think as they age, that becomes less true. The fear of death becomes more palpable. How do we get ourselves out of the funk of these future focuses and into living in the moment?
I think there are two levels at which you could approach that. So one is a social level that maybe we can come back to, which is, you said there's the treadmill of needing to make money, and there's social pressure to invest oneself in this type A telic project achievement mindset. And there you can fight it, but ultimately I think there are changes to society that would make it easier for people to live this way. Now, okay, while we're waiting for society to change or working for society to change, what can we do? I think one of the roles of meditation is to help people detach from thinking about the future. So I do a kind of mindfulness meditation, and part of it is just focusing on breathing or sitting or listening or one's body in order to get used to the capacity to appreciate simple atelic activities. And that has value in itself, but you can also carry it into your life. And I suspect that for many people, Stoic reflections play this role also, that one of the things that happens when you pause to think about a kind of a Stoic insight is that you're in the moment thinking, detached from worrying about what the next thing is, or you're making a kind of shift away from the rat race in entering that headspace. And then, there's also the content of what's being said, but even just the sheer act of it is a kind of resistance to the treadmill in its own right.
Have you found any useful tools for reminding yourself to do that? It sounds like you've gotten in the habit of meditation. How did you start that? For Stoics, it's wake up in the morning, reflect upon what the day is going to be like. And before you go to bed at night, reflect upon what the day was, how you could do better, why you were grateful for the day you had. So meditation is, of course, built into Stoicism. But how does one get into that habit other than just, to give the very blanket and perhaps curt advice of, well, just start?
I would say I am not a great model here. I wish I had a habit. I do it on and off inconsistently. Sometimes I have good stretches and then I'm terrible for weeks. And it is surprisingly hard. I mean, when I do it, I've never been one of these people who meditates for an hour. It's been short periods. And I think, why is it so hard to find 15 minutes to do this? And I've never quite understood why it seems like such a hurdle. My sense of the practical strategy that I find best is this thing that I think comes from Charles Duhigg, who wrote a book about habits called The Habit Loop, where you take some existing habit you already have and you hook something onto it. And if you can do that, you're in business. So if you have coffee for breakfast every morning and then you do the dishes and then you have a shower, if you could just slot into that routine, I'm going to do this meditation on what the day is going to be for 10 minutes, then you're going to have the reminder will come from your own existing habits every day. And then all the habits will be mutually reinforcing.
It's an interesting example because the way that I started being able to do those meditative moments more frequently was I do have coffee every morning, and instead of having it in the kitchen while I ate cereal over the sink, whatever rushed manner I was in to go do that telic activity to chase that money, I decided that I would start having my coffee outdoors, that I would sit on my front porch. And I found it when I was outside, much easier to get into that reflective state. So that turned into just a more enjoyable experience of having coffee at first. And then it turned into, hey, I actually feel clear-headed enough out here that I could probably bring my journal with me and plan the day out. And I can maybe ask myself the question, what's great about today? And so now my habit is that I have coffee every morning, weekends included. I plan out the day, or, a rough sketch of the things I'd like to accomplish in the day. And I ask myself, what's one thing that I'm thankful for that I should be more appreciative of? And that's has really changed my life in the few years that I've been doing it.
I think there's a general insight there, really, which is environment is hugely important. So you move into a different environment. One thing you've done is maybe hooked onto the coffee loop, the habit, but you've also removed a whole bunch of cues that would distract you and make you do something else. So this is why, turning off the phone and putting it in another room is important, because once it's there close by, you're just fighting it. So someone once wrote a wonderful paper, philosophy paper, but it's really just very simple about what they called the mathematical pull of temptation. And they made this really simple observation. If you're locked in a room for an hour, you're trying to quit smoking, and you're locked in a room for an hour, and if you press a button, you get some cigarettes, you're going to press it because you're going to be as strong as your weakest moment. Whereas if you're in a room and you're told you can have cigarettes after you get out of the room, but if you press this button, we'll destroy the cigarettes, you're going to press the button because you're going to be as strong as your strongest moment. And so just by manipulating your environment so that so that you're not in a position where you can give in to temptation, you're going to kind of control how your strength of will affects your life. And environment there is at least as important as any kind of inner strength. And it's the sort of wisdom to think, okay, what environment do I need to be in order to change how I'm living?
I think if I could be honest with you, it was one of the fears I had during the initial COVID pandemic shutdown was I thought, man, you're going to bring people's work home with them, which is something that I think most people who have ever tried to improve themselves, it's one of the things that they learn not to do. And I think maybe one of the causes for the rise in depression and anxiety has been this inability to escape your constantly, I'm going to use your verbiage, your constant telic focus, because now your office desk is in your house and it's hard to find a place to go read a book or get away from it.
I wonder if the opposite thing is happening too with the phenomenon of the Great Resignation, because as well as bringing your work into your home and sort of interrupting that space with the projects of work, you're also now putting your home environment is around your work. And the disruption, the fact that the work is unpleasant and that you'd rather not be doing it is even more salient when you're at home and you could be doing the other things that you actually enjoy doing instead. Whereas if you're actually at work, what else are you going to do? Chat to your coworkers, get the work done. So I think both things are happening at once. This sort of shift in the salience of different options is creating a real tension. And I think we're seeing the effects of that. And, maybe there's a special source of a kind of wave of reflectiveness in people's lives that comes out of the pandemic, of this sudden disruption that makes you think things can really change. Am I actually happy with the way I'm living my life? Is this actually how I want to live? And that does seem to be a real phenomenon.
As if the COVID pandemic was, amongst other things, maybe one of the benefits was that it was a huge disruption to the telic focus, and it was the thing that broke our focus on those things, and now we're thinking differently. I think that's great. Listen, Kieran, we're going to take a short break to hear from a sponsor that makes this show possible, and when we come back, we'll talk about loneliness, the meaning of life, and comparison. Stay with us. Continuing the conversation with Kieran Setiya of MIT and author of the book Life is Hard, which you can find on Amazon and anywhere else you get your terrific books, wherever you buy terrific books. It's the only place you can find his book is where you buy terrific books.
Yeah, I was very insistent on that. Yeah, sure.
Let's talk about comparison. We all do it. I think we look at the success of others and we think, well, they're my age. How come I'm not there yet? Or we look at people younger than us and say, gosh, how did that TikToker already become a billionaire or a millionaire? I'm 40 and I'm not a millionaire. How'd they do it? I must be a real piece of crap. Philosophy can help us to understand why we shouldn't think that way, but let's start with the question, why shouldn't we think that way?
Anyone who resonates to what you just said, which is most everyone, has a sense, even as they're doing it, that there's something damaging and self-undermining about it, and that there's a kind of distinction that I think we cotton on to almost immediately that was made by the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau between what he called amour de soi and amour propre, where amour propre is this sort of comparative, competitive thing. And amour de soi is just healthy concern about your own life. There's nothing wrong with caring about yourself, but when it gets entangled with these comparisons, it feels and is destructive. And it's bound up with a kind of larger thing, which is about what I sometimes call existential FOMO, where it's not just about which party you're missing out on tonight, or are your friends somewhere without you? It's, are there whole other lives I could have lived? Why did I make this career choice? What about the career as a rock star that I dreamed of having when I was in high school? And it's very easy to slip into a mode in which you're sort of stepping back from your life in a way that seems reflective and thoughtful. And as you step back, it becomes clear that there are other things you could have done. And then you start to be stricken with this sense of regret and missing out.
And I think more than that is this person, those people are going to die happy, and I'm not going to. That's a real fear as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of illusion here. But yes, I think that's right. I mean, I remember, one of the things I talk about in the book is my experience with chronic pain. And I remember at a certain point thinking, yep, this is going to stay with me. I remember looking across the room at other people thinking, you don't know how good you have it, like not being in pain. And then there was a kind of beat. And I thought, I have no idea what's going on with those people. Like, they don't know what's going on with me. They can't tell I'm sitting here in pain, and they could be going through vastly worse things. So I think this often when you have that sense, oh my God, other people have it so good, part of what's going on is a sort of asymmetry in which you're exquisitely sensitive to the ways in which your own life is bad. We all are. And you have to remind yourself, everyone is living a life in the same way. And they all have their own hidden forms of struggle as well. That's a kind of reminder it's useful to give oneself. There's probably a Stoic meditation on that too, I bet.
It's obvious that we shouldn't be too concerned with what other people have versus what we don't, or what we think other people have. And it's easy to say that. It's easy to understand that perhaps from an academic standpoint. But how do we stop ourselves from feeling that way? How can philosophy help us not just to identify when we're doing it, but how to stop?
I think that's a very hard question. I mean, philosophy, often what happens is it's a bit like cognitive therapy, where you make a kind of cognitive breakthrough and realize that some false belief was causing you trouble. And cognitive therapy has roots in Stoicism. I mean, that's where it sort of came out of. And there is, just as in regular cognitive therapy, sometimes you make this cognitive breakthrough and then your feelings are slow to catch up. The same thing can happen in philosophy. I mean, an exercise I have found useful is this sort of reversal, where when I feel like there's all these great things in the world that I'm missing out on, and I'll never get to do, to think, okay, what would it be like for me not to miss out? In order for me not to miss out, you'd either have to you'd have to simplify the world so that there isn't this incredible variety of things worth doing, or you'd have to change me so that I'm so narrow that I can't really appreciate them. And I don't really want that. So actually, I'm really glad I'm the kind of person who can think, I wish I'd been a rock star, or, maybe I should have been a medical doctor and like my father wanted me to be. Because if I wasn't the kind of person capable of that, I would be a very diminished person. It's a kind of manifestation of one's own capacity to appreciate the world and of how much the world offers for us to appreciate. Now, again, that's a kind of cognitive therapy. It's about reframing things. But I have found that helpful in these moments where I'm stricken with this sense of how much better things could have been.
One of the things that this habit of comparison can lead to, if you don't get a handle on it, is some feelings of sadness, depression, and I think ultimately they can lead to feelings of loneliness, which is something you talk about in the book as well.
That's right. So, loneliness was I was already planning to write about loneliness in the book. I started the book before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit, and it seemed...
You got a proper masterclass in it.
Yeah, everyone was suddenly dealing with it in ways that they had never dealt with it before, and it was unavoidable. And, there's a kind of shift in thinking about friendship that I think is really helpful here. Because when you think, like, what is the problem with loneliness? It's that our social needs are not being met. And we're social animals, and we need other people. What we need is broadly speaking, friends. And, you got to understand friends broadly. It could be family, it could be a romantic partner, but friends in that broad sense, that's what we need. And why? What do we get out of friends? Aristotle, who is one of the great theorists of friendship, has this picture of friendship as basically meritocratic. So you can only be friends with people who are really virtuous. And what you get out of friendship there is you get to do virtuous things with them, and you get to know you're virtuous too. And some people will resonate to that and think of friendships that way. I don't think that's the best way to understand the value of friendship. There's this shift in how to think about the value of human life and the value of friendship that happens sort of post-Aristotle in the Enlightenment, in which the idea of human beings as having a kind of unconditional value becomes part of common sense morality, really. And I think part of what happens in friendship is that we appreciate another person. It's not just that they've got virtues that we admire. We sort of admire them regardless of their virtues. And part of what's comforting about friendship and love is not, hey, this shows that I'm awesome. I'm loved regardless of whether I screw up, regardless of whether I have virtues. And I think that's what we're missing in loneliness, and the sense of the affirmation of our value just as human beings. And this is a sort of abstract philosophical account of what's going on in loneliness, but it does have a practical upshot, which is what it suggests is that there's more continuity between loving friendship on the one hand and more minimal forms of respectful, compassionate, attentive interaction on the other. And when you look at the social science, it bears this out, that you can do a surprising amount to mitigate loneliness just by brief moments of paying attention to someone else, listening to them, having them listen to you. That moment of mutual recognition, even if it doesn't go anywhere, is already sort of scratching the itch. It's already addressing the sense that you're not really valued as a human being, which is the deep, soul-rending sense of nothingness that you feel when you're really lonely.
And something you said earlier about how Aristotle's idea of friendship was that you had to hang out with only people who were virtuous. Well, the modern interpretation of that is you are the combination of the 7 people you spend the most time with, right? If you want to be successful, hang out with successful people. And there's definitely a value to that I would agree with, but there's also a significant detriment to not hanging out with people who aren't those people, because you're not learning about other people's problems, you're not learning other people's perspectives. And when you learn about those things, you don't just perhaps become friendly with them and help them, as you become more aware of things that you weren't aware of before. Because if you were only hanging out with super successful people who had no problems and had all the shit together, you would have a lot of blind spots. So I like everything you just said.
I mean, there's so many layers to this. I mean, the same thing is true that one way to think about this is the self-other flip and think, if I only hang out with people who are really successful and that's the condition of friendship, then I'm in a kind of precarious situation here. If other people relate to me in the same way, I better remain successful, or And there's a way in which making friendship dependent on people earning it in that way is a way of being fickle. I mean, Aristotelian friends are in a way kind of fickle. They'll drop you if you lose your virtues. Whereas most of us probably know friends we've had for a long time who were like, this is not a great person anymore. Things have really, but nevertheless, I'm invested in them. At the very least, I care much more about them turning it around than I would about some random stranger who's not a great person. So I think all of those aspects of friendship sort of come into view more when you think about it just in terms of appreciating the value of another human being.
This is where I think the second half of the Stoic philosophy, or the second largest part of the Stoic philosophy, which is, right, the first half is we're trying to develop Stoic minds, strong minds, resilient selves. The other half is we're trying to be in service to our community. So showing up and participating. Part of the Stoic philosophy is that you have to participate when you see problems. And I think that in today's world especially, and maybe it's because of COVID, maybe it's because of past presidents who will go unnamed, there's certainly a feeling of it's hopeless and I can't change anything and the world is circling the drain and Western values don't matter anymore. And that can feel very hopeless. It can feel depressing and sad, and that in itself can make you feel lonely. Do you have any cognitive tricks that you use to say, hey, I'm pulling back a bit and I'm noticing that. I've got to do something about that. I've got to overcome anxiety and actually interact. I've got to go talk to that person over there, or I've got to leave my house. I've got to do something.
There isn't a simple answer to that, I think. When it comes to loneliness, there's a catch-22 problem, which is the more lonely you are, the more you're worried about social interaction. You don't feel you feel worried about your own value, and that makes it harder to reach out. And, ideally what you'd have is a friend who would help you through the loneliness, but then it wouldn't be quite such a problem. So the main advice really is to begin with these low stakes interactions where you're not, and not to worry about whether this will be a friendship or what the relationship will be, but just to pay attention to someone else. So that the way out comes from paying attention to other people, not yourself. And then the worst case scenario is you did something nice for someone else. And, that's not a bad thing. And again, that's something that John Cacioppo, who's a psychologist who writes about loneliness, has a lovely line about this, that when you're lonely, you feel hungry. But the thing you have to learn is that you have to feed someone else first. And I think there's something right about that you've got to reach out to other people and pay attention to them without worrying about whether your loneliness will be met. And you will find that if you do that, your loneliness will be addressed. I mean, people often have this kind of attitude, this kind of argument too about happiness, that if you just aim directly at happiness, you're not really going to be invested in the world in a way that will give you sources of happiness. You've got to actually invest in the world and engage with the world. And then, if things go well, you'll be happy. But that will be a side effect. You can't just aim at it directly. And connections with people in loneliness are something like that too.
Well, let's slide into, I guess, what will be the second to last thing we'll talk about, and that's regret. I think that perhaps the most powerful benefit of any philosophy, so long as it's a good one, is that you find yourself regretting less and less the longer you become a good practitioner of whatever philosophy you've adopted and put into play in your life. You've written about regret, the dangers of it. I'd like to just hear your take on the concept of regret in general and what philosophy can do to alleviate it.
I think some of what we talked about earlier is relevant here about comparison and sort of the sense of missing out on all the lives you could have had. I mean, the other thing to say here that I think is maybe counterintuitive coming from a philosopher is that actually the tendency to step back from life and take stock, while it can be valuable and plays a valuable role, brings with it risks. So if you step back from your life and think, is this the best life I could have had? Could I have had a better life? Could things, if I'd not made that mistake or that terrible thing hadn't happened to me, could it have been better? The answer is often yes, it could have been better. And if you just look at the sort of abstract picture of your current life and some imagined alternative, it will seem like you have a lot to regret. But what you've done in a way there is, by abstracting from all the particular details of your life, like the particular people the particular activities you're engaged in, because you think, well, I could have known better people, or I could have done better things with my time, you're actually giving up on a major source of affirmation that's available to us that I think is completely rational, which is the affirmation that comes from immersing yourself in the particulars of your life. So, as I said, it's weird advice maybe coming from a philosopher, but when it comes to regret, I think a certain amount of immersion in the particular things that are good in your life is the crucial antidote to the abstract thought, well, it could have been better. And I think there are Stoic meditations that play this kind of role. You mentioned earlier that things I'm grateful for. It's not that you're grateful because they're the best they could possibly be, or they couldn't have been better, nothing better could have happened. The thought is, it doesn't take that to be okay with your life, to affirm your life. It has to have enough good things, and sometimes that's a real challenge. It doesn't have to be the best. And if you step back from all the good things and try to evaluate it in this detached way, you're taking a kind of, philosophical risk.
Well, that's going to lead me to my last question. Actually, there's a trick at the end of this interview that you don't know about yet, but
okay.
You're going to find out and it'll be fun. That question is, what's the meaning of life according to Kieran Setiya? For me, I'll share, because this is the first interview I've done on this show, so I think it's fair I have to answer it first. I think the key to living a contented life is to realize that there is no point in it, that it is temporal and that it's going to end. And that in spite of that, first you have to identify that, and in spite of that, you have to create your own purpose and fully delve into that purpose to make the most of your time. And I think that is the meaning of life, or as good as it can get.
That sounds pretty good. I mean, I'm going to do the philosopher thing of making a distinction here, but hopefully it won't be too nitpicky, which is, I think there's a distinction between what it takes for an individual to live a meaningful life as an individual, where one person might and someone might not. And this question, like, what is the meaning of life, where we're looking for something that has one answer for all of us. So I think what you said is very illuminating about the idea of how to find a meaningful life for oneself. I think the question, so I'm going to answer the other question, but I'm going to do it as briefly as I can. The thought is, what are we looking for when we ask for the meaning of life? It's something like this. The question is, if you take the universe and the place of human life in it, and my place in human life. How should I feel about that? Is there any way I should feel about it? Is there some way to describe the whole course of human history that tells me, as it were, what it's all about and how I should feel? And I think some religions say, here's an answer to that. There's a sort of off-the-shelf answer. Like you, though, I'm an atheist. And I think, well, really, the only kind of answer there can be to this question, how to feel about human life and its place in the history of the universe, is it depends. It depends on how human life goes. If human life goes out in a kind of catastrophe of climate change and civil war and nationalist violence, then how should I feel about that? Pretty bad. If we manage to get it together over the course of maybe decades, centuries, and achieve not utopia, but we manage to make it through the crises that are ahead of us and make a more just society. If you look back and say, how should I feel about that? I think the answer is, hey, if that's the story of human life, I should feel okay with that. That's pretty good. So in a way, I think for me, the answer to the question, what is the meaning of life, is it really depends on how human history goes. And that depends on us. So, the good news is I think life could have meaning. And I guess the mixed news is whether life has meaning depends on what we all collectively do to shape human existence on this planet. And we're at a point where, what we do in the next few decades will be a very, very big part of that.
All right, here's the surprise. I'm going to give you a thought experiment.
Okay.
It's not going to be the trolley, I promise.
Thank God.
This one is known as The Drowning Child. It's by Peter Singer. You might know it.
Yes.
But it goes, for those who don't. A man wearing a $1,000 suit sees a child drowning in the ocean and being pulled away by the currents. He doesn't have time to take his suit off and save the child. Is the man morally obligated to jump into the ocean and ruin his suit to save the drowning child?
So my answer to that question is basically yes. I guess I could sort of imagine circumstances in which the man's life is sufficiently precarious that losing that suit means losing everything. But assuming that it's just a regular circumstance, yes. I think that the big questions this raises, which, in the 30 seconds we have left, whatever, we're not going to get to the bottom of, are exactly what that tells us about our relations to other people. So I think we have obligations to other people, and we sometimes have obligations to make really significant sacrifices to help other people. Then the question is, okay, but there's so many people who are in need, and so many people who I could in principle help, by donating another $1,000 to UNICEF, say. What do I do in the face of the fact that those demands are so overwhelming? And I think, yes, we have obligations, but the challenge that's very hard that a lot of us face when, we're looking at the news, having a sense of just how many crises the world is facing, is I can't do nothing, but how do I figure out what I must do? And that I think there's no simple answer to.
For the record, I would ruin the suit as well.
Yeah. Good to know.
Listen, Kieran, this has been a great chat. I've had a good time. I hope you have as well.
It's been fantastic. It's been great to talk to you. Thanks for doing this.
And could you give people some ideas of how they can follow you, find you? Where can they find your book? What would you like listeners to do?
So the book is called Life is Hard, How Philosophy Can Help Us Find Our Way. I think it's out right now, pretty much, when this podcast comes out. It's available in all the usual places. I'm online at Kieran Setiya on Twitter, and www.ksetiya.net is my website. But also, if you can spell my name, or even if you get close, Google will take you to me.
Well, thank you again, Kieran. It's been a pleasure having you, and I hope to have you back again once the book has found some success, and maybe you write your next one. I'm sure there's another one on the waiting list.
That would be a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation between myself and Kieran Setiya, author of the book Life is Hard and philosophy professor at MIT. If you're looking for the links to his social profiles and to his book, you can find those in the show notes of this episode. And I should say, right before we go, I loused up the intro of this episode. What I should have said was that the aim of these new episodes on Wednesday are not necessarily to further explore Stoicism, but to further explore philosophy in general. And I thought this conversation with Kieran would be a great intro to the exploration of philosophy more broadly, which is why our conversation spanned so many things and was so general. I hope that got across in the content, because like I said, I kind of loused up the intro. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have feedback or questions, you can always go to stoicismpod.com and hit me up in the contact form on the contact page. And if you've got ideas for future episodes or authors you think I should interview or should be on my radar, let me know. And with that, I hope you have a great rest of your day. And until next time, take care.